from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We tape this program today. It is December the 10th, 1998. On this given day, 50 years ago, there was the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Although this program will air at a later date, we are taping it on that special day. And at North Idaho College, today we have convened to have a keynote speaker and a panel and to view a video of the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We are continuing through this program, that celebration, and we'd like to welcome to the program our very good friend Bill Wasmuth, who is the Executive Director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, which is headquartered in Seattle, Washington. Our guest is the former president of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations and was the pastor at St. Pius X Catholic Church in Coeur d'Alene while he served in that capacity. In his role as Executive Director of the Northwest Coalition has expanded and grown. It serves 6 states here in the Northwest and has a growing staff and addresses many issues. But our guest is here today to address this particular issue. Bill, it's good to welcome you back home, as a matter of fact. And
thank you, Tony.
You've been on the program a number of times over the years dealing with this whole issue of human rights, and we're very pleased to have you here.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm pleased to have regular panelist Steve Shank. He is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and today Steve will commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Bill, I'll join Tony in welcoming you back. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks for being with us. I wonder if you could give us a bit of a historical backdrop. Tony's already mentioned that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of a historic document. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how it came to be.
I think in the wake of World War II and the horrible atrocities of the Holocaust and other aspects of that war, as the United Nations was being formed in post-World War II times, people were struggling to come up with a basic understanding of the rights of human beings that could be utilized to assure that such atrocities as the Holocaust would never happen again to individuals or to a whole race of people, to a whole group of people. And so Eleanor Roosevelt actually was a strong leader in terms of developing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and helped to draft it, led the group that drafted it, and I think provided the leadership as well, as I understand it, as it moved through the United Nations. And it was signed and proclaimed as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations General Assembly on December 10th in 1948. So it's in an aftermath of the World War, and it's in light of the coming together of the nations of the world in the United Nations as one of the ways to attempt to avoid that kind of horrible conflict as World War II was, and to avoid things like the Holocaust again. That's the whole historical genesis as I understand it.
Well, I'm going to admit my own inadequacies as a historian and ask a question that's maybe just a little bit dangerous, but with Tony here as a political historian, maybe I'm on safe ground. This would have to be, I would think, one of the early actions of the United Nations. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it was in very early stages of the United Nations, and it's been one of the, I would say, important foundations of the United Nations. It's its guide, and it's just like the Constitution of the United States has been the guide of our government.
And
yeah, I would think so too.
One other quick question, if I may, and then I'll turn things over to Tony. What was the international reaction to the document?
My understanding of, as I've been reading about it a little bit, was that the general acclamation of the world was enthusiastic about it, that they did see it as providing a basis against which future actions of nations and governments could be balanced and could be kind of provide a standard against which things could be measured, and that hopefully that measurement would serve as a way of deterring such criminal action in the future. I think we've got several cases going currently in our society that are in the news in our world that maybe are reflections of some of this. One of them is Pinochet in England, as he's being arrested now and being handed over to tribunal, a court of law, for his crimes that he committed in native Chile when he was a dictator there. That's all part of this international recognition that there are basic human rights and there are basic laws that inform those rights. and his being brought to a court of law as a result of his actions to account for his actions. And the other one is the trial that's just starting in The Hague for some of the leaders of the genocide in the former Yugoslavia. As we see those kinds of cases coming to the court of law, we start to see, I think, some of this basic understanding that's codified here in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We start to see that have some effect on the actions that we take as a society in our world. That no longer can a person who is a dictator of a country get by with whatever they want to get by with just because they happen to be the ruler of the country, and they can thumb their nose at the people that are in their country, and they can thumb their nose at the international community. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations behind it is an authority for the world that is saying, no, there are some basic human rights that no matter what your level of autonomy might be in your own country, you still can be held accountable before the world population for those atrocities. So I think there is those kinds of steps that have been taken. In many ways, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been very effective, I think, throughout the world in moving us forward as a world population. At the same time, it has been grossly ignored. It's probably one of the most used and ignored documents at the same time, if you want. It's been grossly ignored. It's been, in many cases, shelved, and in some cases, absolutely avoided. Millions of people have been denied in these last 50 years the fundamental right that's in Article right at the very beginning, namely the right to life. They've been denied that by the genocides of Rwanda and Bosnia and other places that have taken place in Article 25 and 26 that talks about the right that people have to an economic life standard and to adequate housing and food and clothing and medical care, etc. That's denied routinely, daily, to millions of people in the world and to many people in the United States as well. I mean, we have 1 out of 5 of our children in the United States that go to bed hungry every night. That's in violation of a basic human right that those children have. So, at the same time that it is making some difference in our world, it's also routinely ignored. I suppose that only makes sense because we're on a journey as a human race, and we're moving toward a goal. If this thing was perfectly implemented throughout the whole world, it'd probably be as close to utopia as we could possibly be. So it's a goal that we're moving toward and that we're heading in the direction of.
Thank you.
In your keynote address on campus today, celebrating the 50 years of this declaration, you also define human rights. And since it is called the Declaration of Human Rights, let's take that step now, Bill, and share with the viewers your concept of what is human rights.
Well, we almost have to start by saying what it is more than, and it's more than positive rights and positive law. Positive rights are those rights that we can look for to a law to clarify for us and to implement for us. They come from a law, for example. And so those positive rights and those positive laws is one aspect of it. But basic human rights don't come from law. They can be implemented by law, but they don't come from law. Basic human rights are not granted by any legal system. Basic human rights are granted by the mere fact that we're human beings. Every person, by the fact that he or she is a human being, no matter how young or how old, no matter what race or what religion, every person, because of the fact that he or she is a human being, inherently has human rights, just by the fact that they are human. Not because of any law, not because of any government, not because of any treaties or whatever, just by the fact that they're human beings. So it's the law it's the rights that come to us inherently as human beings. And that's the natural law version of it, if you want, that just by the fact of who we are, there are rights that are impinged upon that are contingent upon that. So, and then from there, you can start developing positive rights and positive laws that implement those basic human rights laws. Maybe an example. If a starving person steals from food in order to survive from a person who has more than enough, according to positive rights and positive law, he's broken the law, and he can be charged for breaking that law and can be punished for breaking that law. Now, from a human rights perspective, we would look at that and say being charged for stealing that food is unfair because one person has more than he or she needs and the other person has less than he or she needs. And for the person to survive, to take from the person that has too much in abundance is a natural right. We all have a right to survive. We have a right to enough food in our society. So that's where natural human rights start superseding positive law. You can't get into horrible conflicts there where we start running into a very difficult kind of ordering of society. But that provides an example of how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how human rights really are more basic and are more fundamental and are more at the foundation of who we are as human beings and how we relate to each other than positive laws are or than positive rights are. Those are implementations of the human rights, but the human rights are more basic.
As human beings, when we discover what those basic rights are, the fact that you are a human being, whatever we want to call that, natural law, or that you come into the world with those rights, as we identify them, as we become more sophisticated in communicating those rights in such documents as Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then should one take those and then test them in relation to positive law and to prevent the chaos that you're talking about, shall we address changing some positive law?
Yeah, I would put it the other way around. I would test the positive law against human rights rather than test the human rights against positive law. Test it the other way around because the human rights is more basic. And indeed, we need to change some positive law. I mean, there's some things, for example, that would be in other countries that we would find in the United States to be very, very challenging. I looked into the possibility of buying some property in, I can't think of the country right now, in South America, where they have, as a part of their societal structure, they have squatters' rights. If you buy property down there and there's nobody living in the house for over a couple of weeks' time or something like that, and somebody who's homeless comes in and sets up shop, they come to own that house. Well, we wouldn't tolerate that in the United States. Our private property rights would say that a person can own as many houses as they want, even though they can only manage to live in one at a time. They can own as many as they want. That's private property rights. But that country is saying the right of people to have housing supersedes a person's right to own multiple houses of property simply because they're able to. So if a homeless person sees a house that is unoccupied and that is not being used, they have a right to go in and settle in that house. And we'd have great conflict with that. And I'm not necessarily advocating that because there's some things to be worked out there. But it's a good example of how there's a different approach to this in different countries. The United States we have such a strong absolutism almost in terms of property rights and in terms of individual rights that in many other countries and many other societies is much more tempered. It's much more tempered amongst the Native American people, for example, as well than it is in our American society as a whole today. But we have such a strong absolutism about property rights. It basically says, I have a right as an individual to do anything that I want to with the property that I have, and I have a right to accumulate as much property as I possibly can. That's a basically inherent right. Now, when we start coming along and saying, what you do with that property can be a violation of somebody else's rights, then we start seeing the red flags go up very quickly about, but you're stepping on my private individual rights of private property. So just as an example, you've got somebody who owns a bunch of timber that's next to a stream. And by cutting down all that timber, which they said is my timber, I can do with it whatever I want, but by cutting down all that timber, you start having runoff go into the stream, which pollutes the stream all the way downstream and starts interfering with the health and sanitation and other kinds of issues for everybody else down that stream. And you back that up and go to this person and say, you can't cut all those trees down. And that person says, you bet I can, because I own the property and I own the trees and I'll cut them if I darn well please. Now, that's one of the cases where we start running into this conflict of absolute private rights in relation to a larger human rights question. So we've got to learn in the United States to see the whole of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not just the parts of it that we like. We like the political part and we like the civil rights part because that's the areas that we happen to be very strong on. And we tend to see violations of human rights as a stereotype of some political prisoner in China somewhere who's being tortured. And indeed, that is a violation of civil human rights. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also talks about economic human rights, talks about cultural human rights, talks about those elements of human rights as well. We choose in the United States to put less emphasis on those aspects of human rights and more on just a couple of the others. We need, I think, in the United States to study a document like this and to have some real dialogues about how that human rights picture is a little bit bigger than just political and civil human rights, that it really does include economic human rights and cultural human rights as well.
Steve Shank.
This is a fascinating discussion, and you get pretty quickly into areas of legal and ethical fine points that we've debated for years.
Right.
Certainly aren't going to resolve today. This document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has not been formally adopted by the United States. That's correct?
It was, the United States did vote on it in 1948, yes. It voted on it then. What the United States has chosen not to do is the several subsequent covenants that were put in place as implementations of portions of this Universal Declaration. And most of the other countries of the world signed those covenants. The U.S. chose not to sign them. And I'm not a historical expert on all the details of that, but I just know there were a couple of them in 1966, for example, that the U.S. has chosen never to sign. One of the more recent ones that I know that we struggle with is the covenant in terms of the rights of children, that the United States has not been enthusiastic about signing that one either. Actually, there was a initiative in Colorado, I believe, in one of the recent elections not too long ago, where there was some kind of initiative that said even if the United States signs this, this initiative would excuse Colorado from following. It's that fear, in terms of that one, it's that fear that somebody is going to tell a parent how to raise their child. Mm-hmm. And it can get all the way back to physical abuse, that you cannot physically discipline your child with physical abuse, and some people want to maintain that right and within family to do that. I can raise my children however I want to, even if it involves abusing some of their human rights to get them raised the way I want to. So that's a little bit oversimplistic, but that's kind of the direction that it heads. So the United States hasn't been a leader in the world in terms of signing and implementing the covenants that have been drafted to implement various aspects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, nor has the United States been a leader in terms of really promulgating what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is all about. It is not a centerpiece of our educational system, for example. I think for many people who are watching this program, they're going to, if they ever have read the Declaration, they would be in a minority. I mean, most folks simply have not, and I would acknowledge I was amongst those. I hadn't read it until just a few years ago when I started going to Kitsap County, which has every December 10th they have a convention of leadership people from that county just to see how the county is doing in relation to human rights. And so I thought, December 10th, this is interesting, better see what this is about. And then that's the first time I read it. It simply hadn't come across my desk or come across my radar screen prior to that. I would suggest that that's probably true of most folks in the country. This 50th anniversary is one of the times for people really to grab hold. It's a very small document. It doesn't take you hours to read it. It's readily available. There are copies from many different places, just to read it and to see how it really does provide a background, a backdrop, against which we can measure a lot of other things that go on in our society. It doesn't solve every question by any means. It doesn't give answers to every question. But it certainly can provide a backdrop for, as we look for solutions to the problems facing our society and our world. If the solutions that we're finding or that we're coming up with are starting to run contrary to some of the articles or an article in this Universal Declaration, then that's a pretty good indication that our solution really isn't a solution, that it's going to be a problem for people in our world. If the solutions that we're finding are in accord with the Universal Declaration as a basic foundational piece, then I think we're okay. It doesn't solve the problem, but it gives us a yardstick to measure solutions against, if you want.
I'm guilty. I mean, I didn't read this document, hadn't read this document before today myself.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you're not alone, Steve.
No, I don't think so. As I went through it, I was struck by so many similarities to some cherished United States documents, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. But I was also struck by the fact that it's pretty broad.
Yes.
It does include things like the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. It talks about universal compulsory education for children. Privacy rights are addressed, and some others. What do you suspect moved the United Nations General Assembly to look for a much broader document than the kinds of things that we have in this country?
I particularly like Article 24. Everyone has a right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. That should be applicable to every nonprofit, including the one I work for. I think what we've got is a a call for us to recognize that in the United States, we don't have the whole picture perfectly put together. As good as the Constitution is, and as good as the Bill of Rights is, and I'm certainly not downplaying it at all, it was a milestone document when it was formed over 200 years ago, and it still serves as a very wonderful document to guide our country. On the other hand, we also know that that Constitution and that Bill of Rights needed to be interpreted and changed over 200 years to continue to be expanded, to really be inclusive of everyone, and we're still working on that. As it was originally interpreted 200 plus years ago, it gave rights in our society to a very small portion of the total population, namely white males and property-owning males at that stage of the game as well. And it's only through amendments and 200 years of court interpretations that that Constitution has been expanded to be much more inclusive. It also was a Constitution that was designed with a very particular ethic and national heritage in its foundation. And I think we have to remember that when the United Nations document was put together, it was put together by people from around the world. And some people from around the world don't always have the same perspective of life and what's good for life as we have in the United States. People in other parts of the world, for example, don't have the same work ethic drive that we have from our Protestant work ethic background. That doesn't mean that people in the rest of the world are lazy. It just means that they put some other things in higher priority than working 20 hours a day. And they rearrange their priorities a little bit differently. So you have something here like everyone has the right to rest and leisure. You have an article in here about cultural attachments. That's not in our Constitution. Those kinds of things that are a part of other societies and that are part of other cultures much more so than they are ours. The long and short of it, I guess, is that our Constitution is reflective of the United States culture and has helped to form and shape that culture. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is reflective of the cultures of the world. And as such, it's broader. As such, it is more inclusive than what the United States Constitution is, I think.
Thank you.
For the viewers who may want to read this document, I can say that I have a copy here on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and it's only 4.5 pages, so it is not a real long document. And there are 30 articles to the document. I want to have a question that has a comparison bill of this declaration and others. I'm in the process of doing some research because we're anticipating bringing a conference to Coeur d'Alene from people around the world, and you and I have been talking about this and excited about it. And I have a book that has already in it 25 charters and declarations from around the world, including this one. I guess my question is kind of a futurist question. Should we examine all of those charters and declarations and constitutions, and with this one, and somehow by contrast and comparison, even this document, could it be void of certain important questions within this universal document?
I'm sure Eleanor Roosevelt would be the first one to say that she wouldn't want this to be considered the perfect document for the rest of the history of the human race. I'm sure it's up for some revisions. It's filled with sexist language, for one, as it would be written 50 years ago. That could be changed. And I'm sure there are some things in here that could be adjusted as well in terms of the larger concepts also. I think that the United Nations somewhere along the line no doubt will convene, would be surprised if it didn't anyway, convene a review committee of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and see if it needs to be updated as human society goes on. We have a whole number of new issues that are facing us that aren't covered in these kinds of things. The whole medical ethics field, for example, is one of them. You're probably not going to find anything in here that applies directly to whether or not you can clone a human being or how that sort of stuff fits in here. The whole rapid rise of technology isn't in here as well. The whole breakdown of national borders as we globalize the country and globalize the world. Those kinds of questions that are facing us that are really new questions that weren't facing the world 50 years ago, that I think maybe would be cause for some review to see if there's some additional kinds of things that need to be put in here or some revisions that need to be made. So my answer to your question is yes. I'm not sure I would like to do it at North Idaho College in the next year, but it would be interesting to hear somebody who would have some kind of a perspective on that from the United Nations, perhaps.
And some dialogue from some individuals that are very familiar with these documents.
Right.
Something else came up in the celebration in the program today, and you were involved with that. In fact, you're the one that brought it up, and that is step one of seems to me that you have the documents, you become a student of the documents, you understand them, but that is only step one. How would you suggest to our viewers that we can see more implementation in different parts of the world of what you started out with, the definition of human rights and the dignity of all persons?
I think there's a couple of things that I was calling for this afternoon that I'd like to repeat here. And one of them is certainly that we become familiar with this and that we become familiar with the whole gamut of basic human rights, not just a portion of it. And for us in the United States, that's going to stretch us a bit because we are comfortable with political and civil human rights. We've been those battles. But we're less comfortable when we start talking about economic human rights and when we start talking about cultural human rights. We're just less comfortable with that. And so I think for most of us in the United States to become aware of this document and what it really means, what it's really saying would be a stretch for us, and that's the first part of it. And secondly is no matter where we're working, what field of the human rights agenda we're working on, that we always work on that in relation to the Universal Declaration, in relation to that total backdrop, so that we don't get caught promoting one aspect of human rights at the price of another. Greenpeace did that, for example, during this past year. I don't know how familiar you or your viewers would be with that, but they started to head in the direction of attacking immigrants as being the cause of the environmental degradation in the United States, and to support anti-immigrant kinds of stances as a way of preserving the environment in the United States. Well, that was fraught with all kinds of problems in relation to universal human rights, and it just didn't recognize some of the things that are really going on. That a country cannot isolate itself anymore in relation to the rest of the problems of the world. We just had a thing in Seattle the other day where they're starting to talk about the pollution of Asia is running across the Pacific Ocean and starting to kind of happen in terms of acid rain in Washington State. I mean, that's all the way across the Pacific. We can't just isolate ourselves. Part of the reason why we have immigrants coming into the United States from Central and South America is because we continue to demand cheap food products from those countries. In the process of doing that, we're establishing huge plantations, which are driving some of the individual farmers off of their land. I'm running out of time, aren't I? You pushed a button here, Tony. So it's running them off their land. They don't have any way to raise their products, and so they're immigrating to other countries. So we're saying you can't come to our country, but we want to continue to have your food. So.
On that note, I had to bring the program conclusion. I'm so sorry we've run out of time, but with you, Bill, it's always good to have you here, and we could also have more time with you. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Wasmuth has been our guest, Executive Director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. We've been talking about the 50th birthday of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We very much appreciate his being with us and you viewing our program. Please join us again next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.